Well, welcome everyone to Yellow Basin Foundation's Vernal Pool Speaker Series. This is the last of our 4 talks for this season's virtual speaker series. I'm Sabrina Britt, and I'm Yellow Basin Foundation's volunteer coordinator. And tonight, I'd like to share screen with you so you can see what we will be looking at. You're all here for our specific talk tonight that features Carol Witham, who is a botanist and a vernal pool expert. She is going to speak to you tonight on plants of the vernal pools. For a little bit of background, this is her time joining us for this speaker series. For those of you, you may have heard this spiel before. I want to let you know that we are doing this program in partnership with California Department of Parks and Recreation. We are specifically working with Yolo County Parks and Rec through a Habitat Conservation Fund grant program, highlighting the vernal pools located at Grasslands Regional Park. Grasslands Regional Park is accessible to you. It has a lot of features that you can access, such as hiking trails, picnic areas. There are 2 archery ranges. There is a large dog park as well. And there's a flying society where you can fly small model airplanes. This is located just south of the city of Davis along Mace Boulevard and County Road 104, and it's about 4 miles south of Interstate 80. It's about 3 to 4 miles southwest of the Yolo Causeway and the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area, which is what Yellow Basin Foundation focuses its education on. So we provide educational opportunities for youth to retired folks, and we do all kinds of community programs and events. And today we're focusing on the vernal pools at Grasslands Regional Park Partnership. There's also a burrowing owl preserve that's on site at Grasslands Regional Park, which is inaccessible, but it's great to know that it's there and those birds are being protected. If you missed our last talk, it did highlight the burrowing owl preserve there with John McNerney. And all of our previous talks are recorded. They're on the Yellow Basin Foundation YouTube channel. And also there are links to those talks directly from our website. There are Swainson's hawks that you can see if you go bird watching out there as well, and other rare and endangered species. This is a 5-year grant project. So it spans from 2019 to 2023. And with our contract through this grant, Yellow Basin Foundation is in charge of delivering outreach curriculum on vernal pool habitat for K-12 students and public tours. And in fact, on May 19th in the evening, from 6:30 to 7:30, we have our last virtual vernal pool tour. And we hope that next year we can offer those in person once again. We have our Discover the Flyway program that allows youth to learn about vernal pools and specific species that live out there. Here's a map to show you where Grasslands Regional Park is located. I talked a little bit about that already. Just puts it into more perspective. Here we zoom in and you can see a little bit more of the area. And if you look right over here, you can see the vernal pool that we specifically are educating about through this grant. And if we zoom in a little more, you can see the outline there. And you can see the grazing that goes alongside it. So there's a lot of agriculture that happens out there. Of course, education and protection of rare and endangered and threatened species. We're doing the Vernal Pool Speaker Series, which you're here for tonight as part of this project. We're doing the virtual tours of our local wetlands. I mentioned the last one is coming up, May 19th. And we also have our critter caper activities for our youth. These are free programs. So if you have contacts with teachers and schools, you have kids in the family, please talk to the school. We have some left until the end of this school year, so we can get you scheduled for that too. We can get your kids excited about vernal pool habitats. This gives you a little look at some of the plants that we'll be learning about more tonight from Carol Witham. Before I turn it over to Carol, if you have any questions during our time tonight, please send them in through the chat feature. So it should be as host only, so all of your questions come to me, Yellow Basin-Sabrina, and at the end of her talk, I'll be happy to field your questions to her. So I'm going to stop share, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carol, and I'm going to spotlight her for you all. Thank you so much for being with us, Carol. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I unmuted myself finally.
Thank you. And take it away, Carol. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. So when I sat down to, first of all, I saw a lot of familiar names on the list tonight. So welcome, and I appreciate you coming and looking at another Carol Witham talk. When I sat down to redo this talk, because no one wanted my standard vernal pool talk, they wanted a talk about plants, I gave a lot of thought to what I wanted to do here. Because I remember the very first, as a docent at Jefferson Prairie, the very first plant slideshow I ever saw was an alphabetical list of the plants when someone would put up an image and then just give you the name and then go to the next plant. And it was infuriating. So tonight I want to try and do something a little bit different. I want to talk some more about not just the plants themselves, but why they're there and what makes California vernal pools so special and everything else. And I've looked at several of the talks that have already been prepared for this series. So I know some of the things I'm going to tell you tonight, you've already heard, but I'm also a firm believer in repetitive instruction. The more times you hear something, the more it will sink in. So California vernal pools exist in many places in the world. Essentially, vernal is spring, pool means a puddle, so you get puddles everywhere. In California, vernal pools are incredibly special though. In Maine, Eva talked about Maine, and in Maine you get the fauna that you see in California vernal pools. You get salamanders and frogs and fairy shrimp and all of that other stuff. But what you don't get in Maine is the flora. And the same is true of most other ephemeral wetlands that you'll see in the world that people will name as vernal pools. So the first and foremost thing is a vernal pool is an ephemeral wetland. But in California, actually three, even though I only have two others up there, three other really important factors come into play. One is California has a Mediterranean climate, which is characterized by a mild, wet winter, which is essentially the growing season in California. Most people think of the growing season as the spring and the summer, and if you're into agriculture, it might be, but you have to apply a lot of additional water and things like that. But in California, the growing season is actually the winter by and large. So we have that growing season while the pools have water in them. And then on top of that, California has some of the highest diversity of geologic features, geomorphic surfaces, soil types on those geomorphic surfaces, how old the surfaces are, how long they've been in place, how they've weathered, all of those other things give California tremendous geologic diversity. So all of those combine in California to give you over 200 plant species that are recorded in vernal pools. The closest vernal pool landscape to California that has the Mediterranean climate and some geologic diversity and everything else is Chile. And in Chile, there are only 16 plants that occur in vernal pools, not 200. So that gives you some idea of how important California vernal pools can be. And it's also why they're such a delight for botanists and educators in California, because it is an entire ecosystem in something you can almost wrap your arms around, which makes it a very special teaching place, especially for children. But I've gotten a lot of adults down on their bellies looking at things in vernal pools too. So with that, I want to start with a simple definition of a vernal pool in California. It's a depression, usually in grassland, but not always. And it's important to note that it occurs on soils that have some kind of impervious layer just below the soil surface. And that impervious layer keeps the rainfall from percolating down into the water table. The rainfall actually perches above the soils, above the impermeable layer in the soil. And I'll show you a diagram in a minute. When you're out in the field and you look at a vernal pool, you often think of them as isolated things. But from an airplane, you can see that vernal pools in California actually occur in very complex assemblages of big pools, little pools, connected together, not connected together, some higher, some lower, some with more water, some with less. So you end up with not just the very complex vernal pool itself, but each vernal pool often occurs in a complex of vernal pools. So this diagram shows, it's a more complicated one than most people show off, but this diagram shows there's an impermeable layer in the soil right about here. And this particular diagram calls it a hardpan layer, but I'll show you in a few minutes that it can be something else. So there's an impervious layer. And what happens is the rain falls down and it perches above this impervious layer and doesn't go into the subsoils. So you end up with a perched water table. And where there are depressions in the landscape, you end up with standing water. But an important aspect of all of this is there's perched water even under the uplands. So the uplands are only expressing themselves because they're higher than the perched water. But below that, there's still perched water. And that's important because as we get into spring, water that's stored over here can actually move over there. And vice versa, water that's in the pool can move into the uplands to feed the plant roots. So it's very complex, especially when you begin to get a whole complex of vernal pools together. So in California, we have three major geomorphic surfaces that vernal pools occur on. The oldest, we're talking 200,000 plus years old. The oldest and the most abundant of the vernal pools occur on the alluvial terraces on the east side of the Sacramento Valley. So that would be just below the Sierra Nevada foothills. And these are rolling landscape caused by erosion of the ancient Sierra Nevadas. Depending on where you are in California, there's dozens and dozens of soil types that can occur on these high terrace vernal pools. So these are the most abundant vernal pools in California, and they were probably traditionally the most abundant, but human history also plays an important role as to why they continue to be the most abundant. So this particular slide is, I'm going to say Mather Field because that looks like a dome in the radar dome in the background. So this is a high terrace vernal pool. They're very common. They have a really high diversity. They have somewhat acidic soils, and they can be very, very showy, but you end up with a lot of microtopography in these landscapes. So you can see the pool in front of you, but you can't see the several dozen pools just over the little hummock next to the pool. So the youngest vernal pools in California occur on a different geomorphic surface. Can everyone see the cinder cone in the background? This is the youngest landform in California that has vernal pools. It is volcanic, primarily mud flow, occurs north of the Sutter Buttes in California. On both sides of the valley, you tend to get these volcanic mud flow vernal pools. Here, the impermeable layer is not a hard pan, it's actually the volcanic rock. And the soils are very, very shallow and tend to be very, very flat. So you get these really broad expanses of vernal pool flora that sometimes can go on for miles. This particular photo is taken a place called Inks Creek Ranch up in Tehama County. Another shot of a different location up in the volcanics. This happens to be the edge of Hog Lake, which is off Highway 32 in Tehama County. Again, you can see the broad expanses of vernal pool flora here. There's actually standing water down over there. This particular vernal pool is in the order of 40 acres. So then vernal pools of intermediary age occur on what is commonly called the Basin Rim formation. And that essentially just means the valley floor above the immediate floodplain of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. These are incredibly different vernal pools for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason is that the impermeable layer here is clay pan. And this would include the Grasslands Regional Park area. And the clay pan swells in the rainwater and essentially makes an impermeable layer and prevents the water from percolating down. The other thing that's unusual about clay pan vernal pools is they tend to be alkaline. If you remember, I told you that the ones on the high terrace are somewhat acidic, but the ones on the low terrace or down on the Basin Rim are slightly alkaline. So there's a completely different suite of species that occur in these alkaline clay pan vernal pools. And again, the landscape tends to be pretty flat and you get just broad, broad expanses of beautiful flowers. So for a little bit of perspective here, this is a 2012 distribution map of existing vernal pools in California. And the high terrace vernal pools occur in this area along the side of the Sierra Nevadas. The volcanic vernal pools are up in this area. And then you get Basin Rim formation vernal pools down in the greater Judson Prairie area, down in the San Luis Wildlife Refuge area, down in the Tulare Lake area, and then down in something that's called Thermalito Ridge, down in the very southern San Joaquin Valley. So most of the clay pan vernal pools are gone. There's probably less than 3% remaining. This is another aerial view of Grasslands Regional Park. And this was taken a little earlier in the spring so that you could see how much of that area is actually agriculture. In fact, there is nothing out there that's not agriculture in the immediate vicinity of grasslands. So of the Basin Rim formation vernal pools, probably well less than 3% remain. Of the other vernal pools in California, we may have as much as 10% remaining. It's hard to say. There have been a lot of different analyses done, but we can't go back in time and know exactly what it looked like before humans, particularly before European humans came to California. So it's a best guess based on soil formations and a bunch of other things. So we think there are about 10% remaining. But I brought this slide up. This is an aerial photograph of the Mather area, and it's in black and white because I wanted to use it to highlight a few things. An EPA study came out, I don't know, 10 years ago, in which they estimated there might be as much as 25% remaining. And I think that's a bad number. But one of the things that their report really, really highlighted is that what remains in California is very highly fragmented and disturbed. So this photograph shows a lot. I mean, we all know Mather Field is one of those gems of Sacramento County. And yet, you know, the really dark spots you see are the vernal pools. In the middle, you can see the Independence at Mather development. You go over here and you've got golf courses. And up here you have industrial. And down here you have runways. And over here you have oxidation ponds. And down over here you have mining. So that sort of shows you what I mean by the fragmentation and disturbance that takes place in most vernal pool landscapes in California. But I think that's even more clearly depicted in this oblique aerial photograph. This is taken of Mather Field. Prime spring, you can see all the beautiful yellow wildflowers. And you can see, let's see, this is a trunk for sewer system, underground utilities here and there, all kinds of human disturbance on the landscape. So essentially, I think the bottom line is that, I gotta find my cursor, sorry, that there's not a lot left. So when I was working on that 2012 distribution map of the Great Valley with Bob Holland, some additional information came out on protected lands in California. And protected lands is a pretty loose statement, but it means, you know, lands owned by the state, lands owned by the federal government, lands owned by land trusts, lands under conservation easement, and the list goes on. So I overlaid the vernal pool landscape map with the protected areas, and all of the stuff you can see in bright purple is actually protected in California. So there's about 750,000 acres of vernal pool landscape left. And I'm not saying wetted acres, I mean landscape left. And so there's about 750,000 acres of landscape left. And there's just under 250,000 acres of protected landscape. So very close to 30% of the remaining vernal pools in California are protected. And protected is a very loose thing. I mean, down in here in the San Luis Wildlife Refuge, this is actually maintained for waterfowl. So it's very, very disturbed, but there's still vernal pools out there and they're, quote, protected. So, and just for reference, this concentration of areas over on the east side in Merced County is all of the land that was set aside and protected due to the University of California at Merced. And then way up here in the northeastern Sacramento Valley, this is all land that's been recently protected under conservation easement by the Nature Conservancy. And then you can see down in the Jefferson Prairie area, the protected lands down in there. So that gives you some idea of what is out there and how much is protected. So moving on to talk about California vernal pools and their unique and endemic flora. As I mentioned before, there are over 200 plants that have been recorded in vernal pools. About half of those are entirely restricted to vernal pools. They're endemic to vernal pools. They don't exist outside of vernal pools, and they don't exist outside of California. The other half tends to be general wetland plants, a lot of which are somewhat weedy. They may be non-native, they may have been introduced from Europe, and in there you get some of the little annual grasses and some of the annual juncus and things like that. So out of these 200 plant species, half of them, like I said, are entirely restricted to vernal pools. So some of those plants are really common and they occur in many vernal pools throughout California. Some of the plants are globally rare and are in fact listed under the California or the Federal Endangered Species Act as being rare, threatened, or endangered. And then many others are rare at a local scale because they may have a lot of numbers, but they're restricted in their geographic distribution and a lot of things like that that give you an idea that vernal pools are incredibly diverse in California. So I want to start on my little whirlwind tour of the plants with one of my favorite John Muir quotes, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have my glasses on. John Muir in 1869 on his second trip to the Yosemite actually walked across the Central Valley instead of taking a carriage. And so he wrote in his journal that sauntering in any direction, my feet would brush about 100 flowers with every step, as if I were wading in liquid gold. Well, obviously, two or more of the plants that he was talking about at the time were tidy tips and gold fields, which you can see in this image. But that only tells part of the story. He was enchanted because he also talked about how, unlike the prairies of the central states where you had a few flowers amongst the grass, in California, you had a few grass amongst the flowers. So that was very on before annual grasses took over most of the Central Valley of California. So one of the species you can encounter in a vernal pool, and I don't believe this is on grasslands, but it is on Thule Ranch, and it is on other vernal pools in the area. There's actually another small set of vernal pools just south of grasslands. And that is Lymnanthes or Meadowfoam. And Metafoam is one of those really, really interesting plants that, you know, people sometimes ask me, what good are these things? What do they mean for humans? You know, besides having some intrinsic value of their own, a lot of people want to know, well, you know, what good is it for me? Well, Metafoam is really interesting in that the Metafoam plant, each flower produces 5 very waxy seeds that float. And there's research going on right now as to whether or not it can be commercially grown, because the oils in these Meadowfoam nutlets are extremely long carbon chain oils that are essentially the equivalent of sperm whale oil. So they can be used as lubricant for machinery. And so, you know, there is a chance that a vernal pool plant could actually save the whales, right? So Lymnanthes occurs throughout California. There are 5 species that are known to occur in vernal pools. This one happens to be rosy Meadowfoam or Lymnanthes douglasii rosea. And again, I don't know that this is on grasslands, but if anybody finds it there, they should add it to the species list. Another really common species you'll see in the vernal pools and in the adjacent grasslands is Lestenia or goldfields. There are more than 8 species of Lestenia in California, but there are 8 species in California that are intimately associated with either the vernal pool basin or the margins of vernal pools. And on grasslands, the 2 predominant species are Lestenia freemontii, or vernal pool goldfields, and Lestenia glaberrima, or rayless goldfields. And I want to talk just a minute here about these polytypic genera. You have closely related, a lot of very closely related plants in vernal pools. And that represents some fairly recent speciation. So they're evolving almost as we speak. And in Lestenia, you have 2 different sort of distributions that have taken place as they have evolved. In these 2 particular species, which you have on grasslands, the Lestenia glaberrima on the lower right is a much wetter plant. It prefers areas of longer inundation. Whereas the Lestenia freemontii on the upper left is like areas that aren't ponded quite as long and or have flashy inundation. So geographically, these 2 species actually sort themselves out within a given pool basin. When you look at the whole suite of Lestenia that grow in vernal pools, there's other geographic distributions. The Lestenia that grows in alkali areas is very different. You can get Lestenia freemontii in alkali vernal pools, but there are several other species you can get in alkali vernal pools as well. So over time, and with this, this extremely rigorous, severe habitat they live in, I mean, they're flooded in the winter and they're completely dry in the summer, these species have sorted themselves out on many different geographic scales. The small scale within a pool, and the larger scale within the greater area of Sacramento or of California. Then we have Cylocarpus, or woolly marbles. There are 4 species, maybe 6, in California that occur primarily in vernal pools. The predominant one you'll see at Grasslands Regional Park is Cylocarpus Forbissimus, which is this one, which is also known as woolly marbles. And you can really, really see from the summer view why people call them woolly marbles. There are 2 other species on Grassland Regional Park. They're a lot less common. And then we have the Plagiobothrys, or the popcorn flowers. And there are 13 species associated with vernal pools in California, plus another half a dozen or more species that only grow in uplands. Plagiobothrys can be a delight or a pain, depending on your botanical proclivities. You need flowers and nutlets in order to identify them. On Grasslands Regional Park, we have 4 species are on the current species list. The 2 I'm showing here is Plagiobothrys stipitatus micranthus in the background picture, or vernal pool popcorn flower. And then Plagiobothrys stipitatus in the insert photo, which has a very, very large flowers. Or field popcorn flower, alkali popcorn flower. So another polytypic genera you get in California is Pogogyny. And up here in the north part of California, we only have a couple of species that occur up here. This one happens to be Pogogyny douglasii. It is not on the species list for grasslands, but it is on the species list for Tule Ranch. But Pogogyny, the real center of the universe for Pogogyny is actually down in the San Diego area and even northern Baja, where there may be 6 or 7 species that aren't even described yet. So again, this is Pogogyny douglasii. The one you're going to encounter on grasslands is Pogogyny ziziphroides. And you can see how tiny the flowers are in this one versus these great big giant flowers on the douglasii. Common name for this is Sacramento beard style, because the term pogo is beard and gyne is the female parts. And so beard style is a good name, but if you happen to be down in San Diego, they're going to call these mesa mints. So if you happen to hear the term mesa mint, don't be shocked by it. One of my favorite plants in the vernal pools are the Navareedia. And there are, yeah, I have down that we have 8 species in California. That's also open to debate. I happen to know the gentleman back at Brigham Young University who's doing the genetics on all of these. And maybe someday he'll actually publish the paper, so we'll know how many species of Navareedia there are in California. But ones associated with vernal pools or the margins of vernal pools, there are 8 species. And this one happens to be Navareedia leucocephala. Most people I know call it Navareedia. The other common name I've heard is Nivitas, which literally translates to little snow. This is a really, really beautiful plant and can totally blanket the bottom of some vernal pools. Another group of plants really common in vernal pool grasslands are the owl's clover. There are actually 3 different genera in California. Well, there's more than 3 genera, but there are 3 genera associated with vernal pools in California and about 12 species. On Grasslands Regional Park, you will get this one, which is Castanea campestris, or field owl's clover. You can also get Castanea attenuata, which we all call valley tassels. Some people call it narrow owl's clover. Some people call it white owl's clover. And then the other one that you commonly see in this area is Triphoceria eriantha, commonly called butter and eggs. This is another group that segregates spatially in a landscape. So you may have 4 or 5 owl's clover on your site, but some will be down in the bottom of the pool, and that would be like this one. And some would be on the margins of the pool, which would be like the valley tassels, and some would be much, much more up in the damp grassland, like the butter and eggs. Mimulus is a huge genus in California. And I may not even have the right name. They may have changed the name of Mimulus again. It's hard to know. Mimulus is a huge genus in California. And in Southern California, there are a couple of species that occur in vernal pools, but in Northern California, the only species that occurs in vernal pools is Mimulus tricolor, or vernal pool monkey flower. This is another shot of the vernal pool monkey flower, and I've got it in here for a number of reasons. Number one, I really love the glands on the outside of the flower and on the leaves. I think those are really beautiful. But I want to call your attention to how big the blossom is compared to the size of the plant. And I want you to look at the vegetation around all of these plants and see how it just looks mostly like a bunch of little green sticks, and there's not a lot of real vegetation. There's just really big flowers. And I will get back to the really big flower thing in a little while, but I want you to note that in this picture and in a couple more I'm going to show you. So then there's this entire genus in the bellflower family that occurs only in vernal pools, and the genus is Downingia. And there are 13 species in California, plus or minus. They're often called sky blues. Most people I know call them Downingias. The 6 you see on your screen are across the top. Downingia bicornuta, Downingia concolor, Downingia bella, Downingia pulchella, Downingia ornatissima, and Downingia pusilla. As far as I know, none of those occur on grasslands. But cupped Downingia, Downingia insignis, does. And it's one of the larger and showier of the vernal pool Downingia. And again, I want you to notice how big the flower is and how puny the vegetation is. And this is primarily because these are all annual plants, and there's no benefit to grow a lot of leaves when your primary goal in life is to make a flower, set seed, and distribute your seed for future generations. So that's an important factor that we're going to get back to again. This particular shot was actually taken at Grasslands because I see that there's also Downingia bicornuta in the background. So there's more than one Downingia in this photo, but the central picture you see is of Downingia cuspidea, or Downingia insignis, I'm sorry. Oh. Well, this is really, I have no idea why that happened. So another species you'll find in the vernal pools at Grasslands is Oringium. Common names include coyote thistle, button celery, and the amazing part about the Oringiums, they look like a thistle, but they're actually in the carrot family. And so they may be spiny and stab you just like a thistle, but they're really in the carrot family, and they tend to bloom fairly late in the season. So they're going to bloom after most of the vernal pool plants have already bloomed and set seed. And the one on Grasslands is actually Oringium Aristoletum. I don't care what it says on all the species lists I've looked at. They're all wrong. And so you have Jepson's Oringium on Grasslands. And again, it's called coyote thistle or button celery. And you can see the really, really pretty little bluish purplish flowers in the center. So most of the flowers I've shown you so far occur in a variety of sizes of vernal pools, from everything from, you know, the size of your kitchen to many, many acres. But there's an entire sort of suite of species in vernal pools that occurs in something typically called a playa pool. And I'm going to try and explain that, but I don't know how relevant it is to grasslands. So in the vernal pool landscape, in some locations, you get all of these small little things in here. You can see the signature of all of these vernal pools in here. But then you get low spots where you get these giant areas that are lower than the rest of the landscape. And what happens is all the fines, the clay and things like that, that might get washed out of these upstream vernal pools eventually flow down and get into this big playa pool. So the playa pools has got different soils than the upland pools. This is taken, I believe, just outside of UC Merced. And so these are high terrace vernal pools. They tend to be a little acidic, but the pools flow from one to the other in a really good storm. And then all of the fines end up down in this playa pool. And the playa pool then ends up being primarily clay instead of acidic mineral soil. So you end up with this really large pool that ponds for a very long time. It has a completely different soil type. And what you have in these pools, and they occur throughout California, but primarily only in extremely large vernal pools, is you get a whole tribe of grasses called the Orchidae. And there are 3 genera in that tribe of grasses, and 9 species in California, plus probably 2 in Baja California. And the Orchidae grasses, unlike most of the vernal pool flora, which is a fairly recent evolution, the Orchidae grasses are a very ancient evolution. And they probably occupied that Basin Rim soil formation throughout California after the inland sea went away and the alluvium started depositing in the valley floor. They probably occurred in a lot of areas that are now agriculture and or tules. But so you end up with Orchidae grasses in remaining only in these really, really large vernal pools, except for on grasslands. And on grasslands, I think what happened there is grasslands was once part of a really large vernal pool complex that developed when Poudre Creek walked all over that part of the valley floor and would change directions and make oxbows and then change directions again. And where it left depressions due to erosion, you ended up with these highly alkaline, very clay soils. And so even though the pools on grasslands are fairly small, because of its probable proximity to other locations that have these rare grasses, grassland happens to be the home to both Calusa grass, Neostophia colusana, and Tactoria mucronata or Solano grass. And in fact, the population of Solano grass on grasslands is the biggest one in the world. It's only known from 2 other locations besides grasslands. One is Alcott Lake at Jepson Prairie, which was its type locality, the place it was first discovered. And another one is another vernal pool in the Jepson Prairie area on private property, about 3 miles from the original site. And just as an aside, I worked on a federally funded grant that allowed me to collect seed of Tactoria mucronata from grasslands and to take it to Alcott Lake at Jepson Prairie because the population at Alcott Lake at Jepson Prairie had been extirpated due to overzealous academic collecting. There was a researcher who would go out and collect everyone he saw every year, 4 years. And eventually it depleted the seed bank and it hadn't been seen on Jepson Prairie in over 2 decades. And so I got a research grant to translocate seed from grasslands to Jepson Prairie, and it's been successful. And so I'm really proud of that. So anyway, so here's another shot of Neostophia. This happens to be taken at Jepson Prairie Preserve, but you can see the sea of Neostophia grasses in the background. Very, very impressive. clearly wind pollinated. You can see the pink anthers hanging out so that as a breeze goes by, it picks up the pollen, carries it to the next flower. So I'm going to change gears here a little bit. Now, remember that I mentioned that the vernal pool plants are primarily annuals, and that they have no reason to make a lot of vegetation because their goal is to actually make flowers and set seed. Well, they actually have co-evolved with oligolectic bees in the family Indrenidae. And these specialist bee pollinators are solitary and ground dwelling. They collect pollen to feed their offspring. And then they have a life cycle that is very, very closely synchronized with their host plants, which tend to be in the genera of Blenosperma, yellow carpet, which I didn't show you a picture of, I don't know why, Downingia, the Lestenias, and the Meadowfoams. So recall again that there's big flowers and little teeny tiny plants. And on top of that, the big flowers bloom in mass synchrony. All of the yellows bloom at the same, all of the plants in a given species bloom almost all at the same time in these rings around the vernal pools, or in ribbons, or in patches, or however language you want to use to describe this. So here's a vernal pool down in a basin rim formation set of vernal pools known as Grassland State Park in Merced County. And if you've never been there, go there in the spring. It's Department of, it's a state park. There's also some adjacent Department of Fish and Wildlife land. You can go out there, you can wander around, and there's some beautiful, beautiful vernal pools. So, so all of the flowers bloom in mass synchrony for one reason and one reason only, and that is to attract their pollinators. So here we have the 4 different primary genera of plants that have solitary bee pollinators and their solitary bee pollinators. So Andrena submolesta primarily collects pollen from goldfields. Panorgynus occidentalis primarily collects from meadowfoam. Andrena blenospermatis collects from yellow carpet. And Panorgynus, still as of this date, an undescribed but new species, collects from the Downingia. And I do want to mention that all of these photos are courtesy of the late Robin Thorpe, who studied these bees for most of his adulthood. So I said they were ground dwelling. In the top image, you can see a whole bunch of little tumuli scattered over sort of a bare patch area. This happens to be literally on the side of the road out at Jepson Prairie. You can see these. I have also seen them on grasslands. And so you can go looking around for them and probably find where the solitary bees are nesting. In the lower left, you have a tumuli that's closed. And that means that the female bee is actually down working in the nest when it's closed, because she's pushing soil up out of the tunnel and it's accumulating around the surface. And then in the lower right, you see an open hole. And that means she's out foraging because she's finally pushed enough dirt out and everything else. And now she's going to go off and she's going to collect pollen. So she goes and visits her favorite plants and collects pollen from the plants. Oh, I'm confused, but that's all right. You guys will figure it out. So this is actually an excavation of a solitary bee nest out at Jefferson Prairie, and it's just to show you that these are actually pretty deep. These bees are about the size of a small fly, and they dig these 4 or 5 inch deep tunnels straight down. And then they dig a horizontal tunnel out from that, and they make a brood chamber. And they finish off the brood chamber, they feed the young, everything else, they seal that one up, and then they go back to the main tunnel and dig another lateral. So what you end up with is a main tunnel going down and a whole bunch of side tunnels going off like spokes of a wheel. And again, these things are about the size of a fly. In a good year, a female bee can provision maybe a dozen offspring. In a poor year, maybe 1 or 2. So the inside of the bee nest, the brood cell, looks like this, which has been excavated. And on the left, you can see how shiny the inside of that is. And on the right, you can see that there's the bee has started to accumulate pollen in there. What happens is this bee, after digging this tunnel and everything else, uses secretions from her own body to polish off the inside of the brood cell to make it waterproof. Then she collects pollen and nectar from her host plant and accumulates all of it in the bottom and keeps adding nectar and keeps adding pollen until she kneads it into a little dough ball of pollen. And she lays a single egg on top of that. And the egg then hatches out and becomes a larva. Here you can see the larva. And so the larva feeds on that pollen ball. Single larva, single pollen ball. So every time she builds a new brood chamber, it's only from 1 offspring. Eventually, the offspring will eat the entire pollen ball, poop, and then pupate. And so the lower right-hand side of this is a pupa of the solitary bee. So after it pupates, it turns into an adult. And the adult then sits underground until its host plant is blooming. And this diagram was one that Robin did for me for something else. I was working on interpretive science for Jefferson Prairie, and Robin drew this up for me, and I think it's just a really, really great demonstration of this. So we've got, across the top, we've got months of the year. Here we have when the bee is flying. The males fly during late February to early April. The females fly from mid-March to late April. So the flower tends to bloom in really, really early March and may bloom as long as the end of April. So this is what the bee is doing, and this is when the flower is blooming. But down here, you can see that in the wintertime, the bee was sitting down as an adult, an egg, underground, and still sitting around underground. And then eventually the bee gets this signal, and no one knows what the signal is, and the bee emerges just as its flowers are blooming. So then the bee builds a new nest and starts putting eggs down in the nests and builds more complex nests. And eventually, toward the end of April or so, the larvae hatch out and start eating the pollen. And they eat the pollen and eat the pollen and eat the pollen and eat the pollen. And along about September, they pupate. And then about October, they convert into adults. And then they sit underground and they sit underground and they sit underground until the next year rolls around and their flowers bloom and they come out again in order to provision a new generation. This in itself is totally fascinating. But there's a whole lot of anecdotal evidence that the bees will sit underground for multiple years in a drought. If there aren't a lot of their host plants to collect pollen from for the next generation, there's no reason to emerge if you can just continue to hide in your little cubby underground. And so in drought years, you see very, very few solitary bees out because you see very, very few flowers out. But in good years, suddenly there's a huge explosion of solitary bees because there's a huge explosion of wildflowers. And that's because the bees have actually sat underground for a longer period of time than just one season and have waited to emerge when there's really, really good flowers to collect pollen from. So this is one of those sort of really fascinating coevolution stories to me. And it says a lot about how long vernal pools have been around and how long species have evolved together to have this whole synchrony going so harmoniously between the bee and the plant. This bee probably also contributes toward the evolution of the plants because the bees only fly a very short distance for foraging. And so when they're foraging for pollen, they're also pollinating the plants, but they're pollinating like nearest neighbor. They're not flying 10 miles to pollinate some other plant. They're pollinating the same flowers in the same vernal pool. And so you get a lot of inbreeding of the plants within a vernal pool or a vernal pool complex or a small landscape that you wouldn't get if the pollinators flew really, really long distances. And so other insects do pollinate vernal pool plants, but the story about Andrena blenospermatus and blenospermanenum yellow carpet is a really good one because some of Robin's graduate students did a study that showed that if you moved plants to a location where there weren't solitary bees, you got a tremendously reduced seed set from the other insects that may have inadvertently pollinated them. So the pollinators are really important to the plants as well as the plants being really important to the pollinators. So I'm gonna switch gears again a minute here. I hope you guys like the solitary bee story. That one always fascinates me. And I was very, very saddened to hear of Robin's passing and was really wondering where all of his slideshows had gone and everything else until I remembered that he'd given me all of his slides to scan a long time ago to put up on my website. So I actually had his slides, or at least scans of his slides so that I could put into my talk. So anyway, I want to go back to plants in vernal pools. And what I want to talk about just briefly is that the story is really about diversity and adaptation. The plants in vernal pools tolerate the extremes of winter inundation and summer desiccation. In fact, these plants mostly do their primary growing underground. They germinate or underwater. They germinate underwater, and they spend weeks to months underwater before the water evaporates enough that they become terrestrial and they start to bloom. So they tolerate the extremes of the inundation, and then the pools dry completely down during the summer. They're primarily annuals. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but very few. And they all have a long-lived seed bank. which enables them to survive California's variable climate. I mean, we're in the second year of a really, really dry period. In fact, the third driest 2 consecutive years we have on record in California. Next time we get a really good rainfall year, these plants will all be back, I promise you, and they'll be as showy as they can get. The other thing that is really important about diversity and adaptation is the number of polytypic genera that have evolved in vernal pools to occupy geographic niches and hydrologic niches. Remember, I told you in the Lestenia, some of them like the very wettest part of the pool, and some of them like the edge. There's other Lestenia that occur in Northern California that don't occur in Southern California. So vernal pools have evolved rapidly. Vernal pool flora has evolved rapidly, and I'm sure it continues to evolve as we're speaking, particularly given how much we've fragmented the habitat. So another really important item is many of the plants co-evolved with the specialist pollinators, which play a very, very large role in vernal pools. And in fact, the vast majority of the vernal pool reconstructions that have taken place that have failed because there were no pollinators. So in the end, what you end up in California vernal pools are these rings and ribbons and patches of showy flowers. And as the water recedes and the season progresses, those colors and patterns change over time like a kaleidoscope. And that's what makes vernal pool flora so spectacular. So now I'm going to show you some pretty pictures. This is somewhere near Mather Field. I don't know where this is. Pretty pool of Metafoam there. This is out near Jepson Prairie. So every geomorphic surface and every soil type and every pool size and depth and how long it ponds and everything else gives different expression of what a vernal pool looks like. And as Eva probably mentioned, and if she didn't, I will, in the Sacramento Splash program, we teach the students that vernal pools are like snowflakes. No two are exactly alike. This is one of my favorite pools down in eastern Merced County. If the University of California had their way, their campus would have been right about there. And it's not, it's on the other side of that hill. You can't see it. Vina Plains Preserve up in Tehama County. If you've never been there, check on the Nature Conservancy's website and see if they're doing any docent-led tours out there, because the stiles that used to be over the fence that you could just hop over no longer exist. So I don't know what they're doing as far as public access goes. Very, very beautiful volcanic vernal pools. And then of course, Phoenix Park in Fair Oaks. This is open to the public. What you can't see is right off to the right is actually a whole bunch of baseball diamonds. There's a self-guided trail in there, and this particular site also has rare plants. So Phoenix Park is a great place to go look at vernal pools, and they're very, very different than the ones you'll see at Grasslands. They're very different than the ones you'll see at Thule Ranch. They're very different than the ones you're going to see at Mather Field. So another location that you can go and visit the vernal pools. And then I'm going to say thank you. And the other thing I'm going to mention really quickly is if you really want to know more about the individual plants and their species names and things like that, the Jepson Prairie Preserve Handbook is probably a really, really good source for the grasslands docents and even the Tule Ranch docents, because it's a similar soil types and things like that. And there are pictures of lots and lots and lots of plants in there. So.
Thank you so much, Carol.
With that, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Carol. What a wealth of knowledge you have, and we greatly appreciate all the wonderful stories you brought to this tonight. We have some great questions I'd like to ask you that people have sent in. There are some lengthy ones as too, which I think we probably can't get to all of them. They're all wonderful questions, and so maybe we can get back to some of you about some of those bigger questions that you sent in too. We have some students on here tonight listening as well. So one is, why are vernal pool soils often acidic? And then on the flip side, what makes the clay pan soils alkaline?
That is generally a mineral deposit issue, and it has to do with what the parent material was that got eroded to make the soil. So the parent material on the Sierra Nevada foothills is a lot of granite and other things like that, and that tends to be on the acidic side. There's a lot of iron, there's a bunch of other things like that. Whereas when you get down into the clay pan vernal pools, you end up with a lot more montmorillonite clay and feldspars and things like that, which tend to make them more alkaline. Part of it also has to do with how the hydrology works. And so in the clay pan vernal pools, the water tends to evaporate, which means it leaves behind any salts and things like that. Whereas in the terrace vernal pools, most of the water is actually taken up by evapotranspiration of plants, which also absorbs a lot of the minerals, so you don't get the mineral deposits. So that is the short answer. The long answer is a whole semester of a geology class.
Thank you. Another question.
You don't need to put me on big screen. I can stay on little screen.
Okay,
just like this.
okay, we can stay on here together, sure. Are there vernal pools on the Sonoma coast?
Yes, on the coast. Probably. There's some stuff on in the coast ranges, besides some of the valleys in the inner coast ranges where you do get a lot of vernal pools like Sonoma and stuff like that. There's some coastal vernal pools that are really, what they are is sag ponds. So you get an erosion on a hillside that a bunch of soil will slump down and make a depression there. And so you get these vernal pools that actually move around on the landscape. In the coastal hills.
Great, thank you. Concerning the bees that you spoke of, what does the female bee live on when underground for multiple years?
Her own reserves. She goes into a diapause. She estivates, sort of like hibernation, only for insects. And so her metabolism slows way, way, way down, and both the males and females do this. Metabolism slows way, way, way down, and they just sit down there and sort of in a vegetative state until they get some cue that wakes up their metabolism and gets them going and makes them want to emerge.
On the topic of the bees.
Cool.
Can they, so you did mention this a little bit, so do they go dormant? Do they sleep? Yes. And is the soil moisture one of the keys to digging out?
No one's quite sure what the cue is for digging them out, but it's very refined because, like I said, in a drought year, only a few bees come out. In an abundant year, a lot of bees come out. But yeah, they estimate, they sleep. Sleep is good. That's a good word.
Great, thank you. This will be the last one I'll go over, and then we'll do a short wrap up. So I just want to share with you too that there's been a lot of wonderful feedback coming in, and along with this question, she said that she's excited to hear your wealth of knowledge. And can you talk a little bit about variation, selection, and evolution between and within vernal pools? So maybe a short answer now, we can give a bigger one by emails.
Repeat the question for me, because I want to
Sure, sure. Can you talk more about variation or selection or evolution between and within vernal pools?
Whoa, I'm not sure that there's a real good answer to all of that, because while we can speculate about evolution, we can't actually observe it unless you're raising fruit flies, and then you can actually observe it. But I think there's a lot of just natural variation, and I think that the bees actually play an important role in some of the selection that goes on. But I also think that the fact that vernal pools have such a long-lived seed bank is really important here, because the long-lived seed bank means that you have a really large buffer against genetic shift. Because if you've got seeds from last year and the year before and 10 years ago and 20 years ago down in there, and a few from each of those come up this current year, you've got a tremendous amount of genetic diversity going on right there. Whereas if only the seeds from last year came up, and that's all the seeds you put back into the soil, you would get a really rapid you could get a really rapid genetic shift. And you get a lot less genetic shift if you've got all of these different cohorts of seeds crossing with each other in a given year. Anyway, I can try and explain that further. If you want to email me directly, we can talk about it.
And there is more to that question. So I did save the chat, so I can share that with Carol, and we can get back to some of you that didn't get some of your bigger questions answered as well. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. I want to thank Carol Witham for giving us her time. She put a lot of work into making this a very specifically geared presentation on Grasslands Regional Park and vernal pools around California. So thank you so much, Carol, for your efforts and your time. I just want to share with you all that we do have some other opportunities coming up. We are moving back to in-person programs. We're excited about that. Our last virtual tour is of the Grasslands Regional Park vernal pools on May 19th from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. So we have beautiful lighting while we're out there for you. And hopefully it won't be as windy as last time, although my volunteer team were great in pulling that off. So thank you. We have these talks as well as the virtual vernal pool tours on our website at yellowbasin.org if you've missed any. And they just link you to our YouTube channel for Yellow Basin Foundation. Our BAT programs are coming back. We'll have, it'll be hybrid, excuse me. And so we'll have a virtual talk portion as well as an in-person caravan out to the Mexican free-tailed bats flying out from under the Yolo Causeway. So those tickets go on sale on May 15th. That's just right around the corner later this week. So please watch yellowbasin.org for those tickets. We also have summer camp programs that are in person. We offered some virtual ones, and those have shifted into in-person ones as well because those are in demand again. So if you have kids in the family that are entering 1st grade through 7th grade, you can log on to our website at yellowbasin.org and register for summer camps too. Our wetland tours out to the City of Davis wetlands are back in person as well. Those are going on throughout the summer. And in the fall, we'll pick back up with in-person wetland tours of the Yellow Bypass Wildlife Area as well. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Everyone, enjoy the rest of your night. Good night.